Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles. On this episode, we're going to talk about the greatest story ever told. And I don't mean the greatest story ever told in ECW. I don't mean the greatest story ever told in pro wrestling. I mean the greatest story ever told, period. I'm going to talk about the feud in ECW of Tommy Dreamer and Raven. Some of the key moments of the feud. By no means is this a deep dive because it is a long and extensive feud that went over several years. I'm just going to talk about some highlights of it. If you want a more extensive version, if you want to watch the entire feud, I'm going to put a link in the description to RF Video, who has a compilation of, I think it's 6 DVDs. I have it somewhere. I couldn't find it to show it off here, but I have a stack of hundreds of DVDs that are all collecting dust because I haven't watched a DVD in probably 5-6 years at the very most. I digress. I'm going to put a link here for where you can buy that compilation because I do think it's something that every wrestling fan should see. Because to me, this is the peak of storytelling in pro wrestling and the peak of storytelling in general. First, let's get into the backstory. The backstory of the feud is that Tommy Dreamer and Raven were both in summer camp together, and Raven was kind of the outcast misfit. Tommy Dreamer was the sports star jock type guy. They were also there with a young lady named Beulah McGillicuddy, who was a heavyset girl who had a crush on Tommy Dreamer. Kayfabe wives, this is where their story begins, even though I think Raven's about 5 years older than Tommy Dreamer, but ignore that for the story. This is where the seeds in Raven's mind were set, why he hated Tommy Dreamer. As far as in ECW, how this was brought up, Stevie Richards started mimicking Raven, aka Scott Levy's previous personas as Scotty the Body and Scotty Flamingo, even wearing the same gear that he wore, which most likely was the exact same gear. And he kept talking about bringing Raven in, although he said he was going to bring in Johnny Polo, which was the character that Raven had played most recently on WWE television as kind of a spoiled rich kid. That brings us to one of the first big moments, the obvious big moment. From January 10th of 1995, Stevie Richards introduces Raven. Raven comes out in a brand new gimmick, which is inspired by grunge and alternative music, and kind of says this is who he is. They say for the past 2 years he was a bodyguard for Pearl Jam, which ties into everything. This was a great introduction. During this, he explains that he hates Tommy Dreamer. Fast forward a little bit to April 8th of that same year, 1995, and we get the introduction. Raven and Stevie Richards are doing an interview with Joey Styles, and Stevie says, I found her. I found the girl, boss. I found Beulah McGillicuddy. And before Raven could see her, he starts talking down on her and asking why Stevie would bring her here. And then we get the debut. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here. At this time, I was just barely 18 years old, and this woman, Beulah McGillicuddy, walks out, and she had to be easily one of the most attractive women I ever seen. And much like, I would say, 90% of the men watching, and probably a lot of the women that are of that persuasion, you instantly had a crush on her. I mean, she was absolutely beautiful. After months of us hearing about this fat girl, and no disrespect to anybody that's heavy, I'm a big man as you can see myself, for them to flip that and bring out this woman who legitimately was a penthouse pet, and it be Beulah McGillicuddy, and she's absolutely stunning, it was something that you wouldn't have seen in wrestling before. If this was done in the WWE, they would have brought out Bertha Faye. No disrespect to Bertha Faye, but this is the genius of this story and how it was told. I digress. That same evening, we get the first match between Tommy Dreamer and Raven, and this is a good match. Towards the end of it, we see Beulah and Stevie Richards on the outside. Stevie is trying to force himself onto Beulah, which Tommy Dreamer, the White Knight, goes out to save her, to run interference to stop Stevie from trying to force a kiss on her, to which she turns around and sprays hairspray in his face, thus creating a reason for Raven to take over, hit his DDT, and pick up the win. So right off the bat, we're introduced to Raven, we're introduced to his girlfriend, who she would become, Stevie Richards as his lackey, and his willingness to cheat to win. Raven was going to win by any means necessary. And in a company that lived by the mantra of no rules, Raven found a way to make himself a heel. In a company where basically you really couldn't be a heel. You would get cheered if you cheated. You would get cheered for doing dastardly deeds. Raven found a way to use that, to use his psychology, which is top notch. In no small part of this story is the fact that Raven is one of the top wrestlers in all of history, psychology wise, and he's working with Paul Heyman, crafting this story with a Tommy Dreamer who would go on to be an excellent mind in wrestling himself, sitting there as a sponge and soaking in all of that and basically turning into Paul Heyman's second-hand man. So we see how this feud is basically going to go. We're going to fast forward a bit to the next, I would say, important moment in the feud. We get a match at Hardcore Heaven from July 1st, 1995. Tommy Dreamer and his partner, Luna Vachon, going up against Stevie Richards and Raven. At the time, Raven had recruited the Pitbulls into his nest, which was what it was called in ECW. The Pitbulls kind of turned face here with the introduction of the Dudley Boys on the other side. This was not Devon and Bubba, this was Snot and Dudley, I believe. And here we are introducing more and more to Raven's cast of just oddball characters. Having Luna in here, which they tied to Raven, saying that while they were in WWF, they had a relationship. This really helped build that story. Now we're going to fast forward to 2 weeks later, WrestlePalooza from July 15th. We get a match with Tommy Dreamer, Cactus Jack, and the Pitbulls. They're going up against Raven and Stevie Richards and the Dudleys. And this was a night which, if you could see here on my shirt, Tommy Dreamer starts to get a little bit of a comeuppance. He gets the chair shot heard around the world, which is what they called it at the time. And the beauty of this is, again, in a company that you could see 20, 30 chair shots a night, this one chair shot resonated so strongly with the fans there that this shirt that was made 30 years later sold like crazy. And I forget where I got it from. It's not officially licensed at all. But I do remember wherever I did get it from, they sold out the shirt in like less than a day. I mean, as soon as I seen it, I jumped on it. This was also the night that Cactus Jack, aka Mick Foley, turned on Tommy Dreamer and joined Raven's Nest, which then gave us some of the great promos in history with Cactus Jack and Raven together, and would lead to eventual Cactus Jack promos on his own. Like I said, a lot of story beats happening at this show. Really great show in my opinion, and a great moment in ECW history and all of wrestling history, if you ask me. That leads us to our next moment that I want to talk about, and that's from November to Remember that same year, from November 18th. Dreamer enlists his hero, Terry Funk, to go up against Raven and Richards. This was important because we get the debut of the Blue Meanie. And the Meanie would go on to be an integral part of Raven's Nest. He was the flunky for the flunky, being Stevie Richards' flunky, and then eventually them morphing off into their own thing and creating the Blue World Order with Supernova. There was a lot of branching stories that came out of this one story, which is part of why I think it's so special. You got the Dudley Clan. You got the Blue World Order comes out of this. The Pitbulls, Francine, they all tie into this story. Beulah McGillicuddy. Eventually later on, which we're going to get to here, people like Brian Lee coming in. And again, we're just touching on the surface of this. There are so many more beats to this. If I were to do a full retrospective, it would take me 30 videos an hour each probably to talk about all of this. We're going to fast forward a bit from there and go to House Party from January 5th of 1996. This is the night that Beulah McGillicuddy announces that she's pregnant. And whether you're a fan of ECW or not, you may have seen this moment. This is a moment that a lot of people talk about as a high watermark for ECW. She comes out to the ring, says she's pregnant, which brings out Raven. Raven gets upset, basically says, you're supposed to take the pills, you take one a day, and it gets really tense. Beulah says the line, what do you care, it's not yours, which immediately Raven jumps on top of Stevie Richards, which I thought was fantastic. Beulah stops him, yelling, "It's not his either." And this is where the ECW crowd comes into effect, because the ECW crowd adds so much to every one of the ECW stories. They start chanting, "It's the Meanies," which is absurd. Meanie starts playing it off. Raven is up in the face of Beulah, and it's very menacing. And she finally says, "It's Tommy's." This brings out our protagonist, our hero of the story, Tommy Dreamer, who, for the first time since the chair shot, it feels like he got one up on Raven. Because at every moment when it felt like Tommy Dreamer was getting ahead of Raven, Raven would flip the script. He would introduce a new member of the Nest, or he would find a new way to screw Tommy Dreamer. This was Tommy finding a way to screw over Raven. A few weeks later, on the 27th of that same month, Raven would introduce his new valet, Kimona Wanalea, which is an absurd name, and another person that you probably know even if you're not an ECW fan from their old videotape commercials. The night that Kimona Wanalea danced atop the ECW arena, which will always stay in my head because I heard that sentence every week for years with them promoting Extreme Warfare Volume 1. And if you watch back in the day, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That same night, Raven wins the World Championship. He defeats the Sandman, which kind of splits the arc a bit here. Raven would go on to a feud with the Sandman, which was kind of intertwined with the Dreamer feud. This would be Raven's second most consequential feud in ECW. Everything he did with the Sandman and the Sandman's wife and his son and everything there, that's a whole nother story. But during this, Tommy Dreamer hasn't given up his pursuit of Raven. He gets derailed a bit here because he starts a feud with primetime Brian Lee, who at the time was part of Raven's Nest. From there, we're going to go to April 20th of 1996, where we have the franchise Shane Douglas getting involved in this, and he's bringing out Beulah McGillicuddy because he's found out that Beulah is cheating on Tommy Dreamer. And if you're starting to notice, this has more of the earmarks of a daytime soap opera than a wrestling storyline, with pregnancies and betrayals and cheating and all of that, which is funny because a lot of people called wrestling a male soap opera. This is where we find out that she was cheating on Tommy with Kimona Wanalea. And this was a moment that was very controversial. It got ECW kicked off of several stations because we had Beulah and Kimona kissing. And to think about that in 2024 while I'm recording this video, just how different it was just 2.5 decades ago that two women kissing on TV could get you kicked off of your television show. So there were consequences. And if I remember right, they didn't actually even kiss on TV. They got to the point where they were about to kiss and it went to black. This is also the same night that Tommy says, "I'll take them both, I'm hardcore," which led to a little while where he had both as his managers or valets. From that, I'm going to fast forward almost an entire year, and we're going to go to the first ECW pay-per-view, Barely Legal. And it would have been easy to think, with the other feud, Sabu and Taz, that Tommy Dreamer and Raven should have been the other main event, but very cleverly, Tommy Dreamer was left off of the card because he gave his spot in a three-way dance to determine who would challenge Raven for the World Championship. He gave that spot up to his mentor, Terry Funk, who would go on to wrestle Stevie Richards and Sandman, and the winner would wrestle Raven. Dreamer was on commentary during this, and he would get involved to help Terry Funk. Funk picks up the win here, and it's one of those things, it's kind of such a great stroke of genius, such a great moment, especially when you watch Beyond the Mat and you hear with the reverence that Paul Heyman talks of Terry Funk and how much he owes to Terry Funk and how much all of ECW owes to Terry Funk. You really understand why this moment needed to be Terry Funk's, and they could put off the moment with Tommy Dreamer because Tommy Dreamer's moment's going to come here very soon. Less than 2 months later, we have Raven's final match in ECW before he leaves for WCW, and that's at WrestlePalooza on June 6, 1997. We get his match with Tommy Dreamer, and both Raven and Dreamer have said that they wanted Raven to win here. The story up until this point was that the 2.5 years that this feud was raging on, Tommy Dreamer never pinned Raven. He beat him in tag matches where he didn't get the win. Any singles matches, Raven found a way to win, but Tommy himself couldn't beat Raven, and he finally did it. On Raven's last night, he pulled it out, he got the win. Which to me, I thought was the perfect choice, especially not knowing that Raven would come back a year and a half after this. It was cathartic. It gave all of the fans of Tommy Dreamer, it gave all of the ECW fans the ending that they wanted. Everybody wanted to see Tommy Dreamer pick up the win. Whether they were fans of Dreamers or not, they wanted that payoff for this storyline, and I thought it was a great payoff in my opinion. Raven goes off to WCW. Immediately afterwards, Sabu, Rob Van Dam, and Jerry the King Lawler and Jim Cornette attacked Tommy Dreamer to start a WWF versus ECW invasion feud. Raven would go on to be an excellent member of the WCW roster, winning the US Championship and Tag Championships there. And about a year and a half later, on the first episode of TNN, and this is the last moment I'm going to speak of on this, the Dudley Boys are threatening to leave for WWF with the Tag Team Championships. They're standing there. Tommy Dreamer comes out to defend the honor of ECW all by himself, when out of nowhere, Raven returns. And Raven wins. And now, the worst enemies, Raven and Tommy Dreamer, are now the Tag Team Champions. And they would go on a nice little run, a fun little frenemy run, but it was a great way to reintroduce Raven, and that's one of the biggest reactions in ECW history. That and the Sandman return, I think, are the two biggest in my opinion. Just more layers to this fantastic feud. And then it would even go on to create layers after ECW. You had their little run on Sunday Night Heat that they did, their on again, off again friendship in TNA, which even leads us to when Raven goes into the TNA Hall of Fame, that he buries the hatchet with Tommy Dreamer, only to turn on him and DDT him on the stage, which was fantastic. It's a great moment for a person like myself that considers this the greatest story ever told. I absolutely love this story. I implore you, I believe it is either $19.99 or $29.99. I'm not sure exact price. I bought it years ago. I don't remember how much I paid. I do know that I'm going to put the link here where you could buy it. And it's totally legal. RF Video has the rights to release this because they had rights with the original ECW before WWE bought the ECW name. So it's not like you're buying a bootleg. This is the original stuff with the original music, the original everything here. I highly recommend buying this set and dusting off your DVD player or your PlayStation or Xbox or however you watch DVDs in the past, because I know most people don't watch DVDs anymore. I would recommend buying this. It is so worth it. Like I said, to me, if you're a pro wrestling fan, you're not going to find a better story than this. It's 6 full discs, so you're going to get a lot of content. And I know this is starting to sound like a commercial for RF Video. I promise it's not. It's just my honest recommendation to you. Whether you're an ECW fan that watched this while it happened, or you're a new fan that wants to go back and celebrate some of the great moments in wrestling history, this is worth getting. This feud, like I said, in my opinion, it stands the test of time. I will put this right up there with the Mega Powers feud, the Dusty Rhodes versus the Four Horsemen feud, the Sting versus Ric Flair feud, the Undertaker Shawn Michaels feud. I will put this right up there with any feud that's happened in the history of wrestling. And to me, it tops them all. The story had so many twists and turns and involved so many different wrestlers. It was just excellence in my opinion. And you may look at the name of the title and you may have heard me say it a few times during this, but to me, that is not hyperbole. That is not overstating the facts. That is just the facts. I do think this is the greatest thing that's ever been told. I think if you took the story outside of wrestling and you put it up with Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, it holds up with all of those stories and whatever else you may consider a great story. It's just that good in my opinion. Hell, if you want to compare it to Days of Our Lives or As the World Turns or any of these soap operas, it holds up with those as well. Just a fantastic story in my opinion, hence why I wanted to make a video about it. I wanted to talk about something that I found so beloved. And honestly, this is a video that I've wanted to make for years, and it's actually scared me to do it. I was afraid to make this video because I honestly don't think I did it justice, and I don't think I could ever do it justice. But I wanted to do what I could. And I hope you took a little bit from this. I hope you take my recommendation and seek this out. It is definitely worth your watching. Like I said, it's my favorite feud of all time, from my favorite company of all time. I highly recommend it for you. With all that being said, if you made it here to the end, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. If you see where it says join, that's how you become a member. Becoming a member definitely helps out. Let me know your favorite feud of all time. Put it down here in the comments. We'll discuss it there. My name is George Coles, and you've been watching Heel Heat.